So Hereditary is one of those movies that blew me away when I first watched it back in 2018. By far, it's my favourite Ari Aster film, and though I've already done a big breakdown on it, I thought I'd revisit the movie to celebrate the release of Beau Is Afraid. You see, back when I made that first video in 2020, I was still learning the ropes, and since then we bought new equipment, hired editors, and just tried to up our game in terms of the level that we pick movies apart. I've never been happy with that video because of how much I missed in the initial watch through, and thus I've decided to return once more to this classic to unearth all the hidden things in it. Throughout this video, we'll be going through every creepy little detail, its ending, and also why I love the movie so much. This high-concept horror was released during a time that there was a big revival in the genre, and alongside it we had movies like The Witch, The Witch, The Apostle, The Ritual, and a lot more. They really broke the mold and moved away from the stereotypical cheap jump scare tactic that so many movies relied on. Instead, the film's laced with this feeling of dread that slowly builds throughout it, and this is seen right from the off. We begin with an obituary for Ellen Lee, and throughout the film we learn more and more about her. And not only was she the grandmother and mother to the family that we focus on, but she was also the queen of the cult of Payman. When doing my research, I found that Payman's one of the 8 kings of hell, and he has the ability to create hallucinations, reanimate the dead, and also to grant flight. These are all things that happen in the movie, and you can kind of piece what's going on with them before we join them the morning of Ellen's funeral. Now, it turns out that Ellen actually offered up her son Charles so that he could be a vessel for Payman, and we see his name in this opening obituary. We later learn that Charles took his own life, and the note that he left accused her of trying to put people inside of him. This was diagnosed as schizophrenia, but in hindsight we know that he was actually telling the truth. Now, because of his death, Ellen couldn't offer up a vessel, but this didn't stop her from carrying out her plans. Ellen also had a daughter named Annie, and she patiently waited until she had a son named Peter. However, Annie and Ellen weren't really on speaking terms at the time, and thus the evil grandma wasn't able to sink her claws in. However, they did repair the relationship years later, and Annie had a daughter named Charlie, named after her deceased brother. Ellen apparently said that she wanted a boy, and at one point we even see a customized mat with the name Charles on it instead of Charlie. They were clearly hoping that Annie would have another son, but they made do and went ahead with putting the spirit of Payman into Charlie. However, Payman desperately desired a male body, and thus he didn't grant them the riches that they'd been promised. Now, the entire story of Hereditary centers around transferring Payman's spirit into Peter, but in order to do this, they have to carry out certain rituals. There's a ton of foreshadowing and things that don't pay off until much later, and we actually begin where we end with us getting a strong focus on the treehouse. This pulls out to Annie's studio, which is where we see several of her miniatures, before we then move into a recreation of Peter's room. The film does a masterful job in giving this idea that something's constantly watching the family, and this is demonstrated perfectly in the opening. As we get further into the model, it then transitions into Peter's real room, and this was done for a symbolic reason. Now, personally, I've always taken this to show that the characters are like puppets that don't really have any control over what's going on. This is given a little nod to later on in the film, and it happens during one of the many classroom scenes. We hear the story of Hercules and learn the analysis given is that the character doesn't really have any control over their fate.
So he thinks he has control. But let's all remember, Sophocles wrote the oracle so that it was unconditional, meaning Heracles never had any choice, right?
This is almost like a Greek tragedy in which the audience would watch the events play out with the characters unaware that an audience was there. The way the miniatures transform into the location also gives this idea that this is somewhat of a stage, and if we're getting meta, then we're very much watching an actor on set constructed much like these miniatures. The classroom analysis also surmises there were signs all around the characters that they refused to acknowledge, much like the people that we meet in the film.
Because he literally refuses to look at all the signs that are being literally handed to him the entire play.
Now, Annie creates these miniatures in order to comprehend and deal with certain situations, but they could also signify that the cult have constructed their entire world. Dolls appear throughout the film, namely in Joan's apartment, and with Charlie, who also makes her own using the heads of dead animals. Now, they actually did a bit of viral marketing for the movie, with the dolls being available on Etsy under the name Crafts by Charlie Jean. If you want to buy me something for Christmas, I'll set up a PO box, mate, and you can send that out. Looks great. Now, beheadings are also rife in the movie too, and we see from the picture of Payman that he rides around with 3 by his side. These 3 are needed for the ritual to be carried out, and in the movie this is represented by Ellen's beheading, Charlie's, and lastly Annie's. Early on in Peter's room, we get a little nod towards this, and we can see 3 hats hanging up on his wall. Now before you go at me for reaching, I think that the colours of these actually show that these have some significance. Annie's seen in the film wearing a denim shirt with white under it, and this is the same as the hat on the left. Charlie wears that giant orange hoodie, much like the middle one, and lastly Ellen wears cream like the one on the right. Now after Peter is woken up, his dad Steve goes out to the treehouse, which is where we're introduced to Charlie. Even though it's freezing, she still ends up sleeping here, and this is where Payman returns to in order to complete his rebirth. It perfectly recontextualizes this opening scene and shows that Payman felt at home here, which is why he returns come the film's close. Now the funeral itself is actually filled with cult members, and Annie even remarks that it's surprising to see so many new people there.
It's heartening to see so many strange new faces here today.
She also mentions about how her mother was I'll let Annie say it.
My mother was a very secretive and private woman. She had private rituals, private friends, private anxieties.
Now these private rituals and private friends were all Payman related, and they had to keep things secret because of what they were actually up to. Here we also see Annie's necklace, which is exactly the same as the one her mother wears in the casket. When we get a close-up shot of it, we can actually see the shapes in the center represent the 3 heads, and thus this symbol itself is a nod to him. It appears throughout the film and later shows up on the post where Charlie's decapitated at before appearing in the attic. It too shows up on the mat, in Joan's house, and on the cover of the book detailing Payman's history. Now Charlie spots this, and when she looks up she sees a man creepily smiling at her. This is the same guy who shows up naked later on in the house, and we catch him standing in the doorway after Peter discovers his dad's corpse. Anyway, Charlie clicks her tongue at the funeral like, and this is later used to denote that the demon has moved from her into her brother. They also do some brilliant shorthand as we see Charlie chomping away on a chocolate bar, which she uses as comfort food in situations where she feels awkward. Her dad asks if it has nuts in it, and this sets up both the reaction later on, and why she feels like she has to go for the cake at the party when she's left on her own. Now the family return home, and there's a nice bit of sound direction where we can actually hear people moving about the house before the family enter. I'll boost the volume in case you missed that and listen again closely. Now I pointed that out in our initial breakdown, but one thing I noticed on top of this is that Steve insists that Charlie takes her shoes off.
Shoes off, everybody. Charlie, shoes off.
Later on, when Charlie's been walking outside in her socks, Annie also tells her to take them off before she takes her own shoes off.
You're going to this, hey, socks off. You're going to this party with your brother.
Parents tend to do this when they're mad at the kids that are constantly leaving footprints about the house, but in hindsight, we know who this is. Later on in the movie, when Peter comes in, we can see there's muddy footprints all over the floor, and it's likely that this isn't from the family. Instead, I think these were left behind by the cult, and Steve was angry there were footprints in the house all the time because they were constantly coming in and out. Later on, we learn they moved Ellen's body to the attic and that a triangle had also been drawn on the floor, both of which probably happened when people were leaving these marks. Anyway, after Steve says goodnight to Peter, we cut to Charlie's room and then see all her dolls. Later on, we get a Payman statue in the treehouse, and this actually somewhat resembles the figures that we get here. The stance is the same with the long legs, and on the back shelf we can see one with a golden crown. Now Charlie and Peter both have opposite reactions to their grandma dying, with the latter being lackadaisical to it whilst Charlie's clearly torn up. And he says,
"You know you were her favorite. She wouldn't let me feed you because she needed to feed you."
Now we actually see a picture of Ellen at roughly the 24-minute mark, and here we can catch her feeding Charlie with a bottle. If you look closely, there's actually a very important detail here, and this highlights what the wicked woman was up to. The top of the bottle has some weird green things floating around in it, and this is the same as what Annie pulls out of the tea that Joan gives her later on. When going through her mother's possessions towards the end of the movie, Annie briefly touches a green bottle, and we can see that this says Dittany of Crete. A huge shout outs to, and I can't believe this username, Sold My Soul to Payman, who pointed out on Reddit that this is actually a magical herb. Dittany of Crete is believed to be something that can make someone astral project and leave their body so that others can then enter it. Ellen was feeding this to Charlie at a young age, and Joan did it to Annie so that she could be taken over too. We also know from the diorama that she wanted to breastfeed the girl as well, and these add such a creepy extra layer to the movie about control and possession. Possession can have a double meaning in this case, with Ellen using her children as objects rather than seeing them as actual people. Now, Annie says that Charlie never cried when she was born, and throughout her childhood, we know this is because of what's really going on. Now at this point she looks up and sees the word Satoni written on the wall. This is a word that pulls from necromancy, and little phrases like this appear throughout the movie. Lift Ocean Pandemonium are scribbled in the house too, with the former of these meaning open. The latter means chaos, and the words all have meanings that are rooted in possession. Now, something sinister is definitely going on here, and Annie discovers a book about notes on spiritualism with a letter from her mother. This promises rewards, and payments state that his followers would be showered with riches. Now, after she turns out the lights, we can make out Ellen's ghost standing in the dock. It's one of the most unnerving parts of the movie, and it's so creepy seeing her standing there in the darkness. And the next day we see Charlie at school trying to stick the head of a toy back onto its body, but she's unable to do this. At this point a bird flies into the classroom window, and she ends up cutting this off for the figure. This is when we catch one of the cult members watching her, and she actually also appears in the attic later on. Now on the opposite side of the school we see Peter in a lesson, and at this point we also meet the girl Bridget. She's played off as the typical love interest that doesn't really go anywhere, but there's actually an extreme possibility that she's part of the cult too. Now in order to talk about this, we have to go on a theory time, gonna blow your mind with a theory time. So we know that at the very least that one of Peter's pals was in the cult of payment. Under the bleachers we catch him and his pals smoking, and on the left we can see someone who has a tied up ponytail. Come the end of the film, we see in the treehouse that there is someone kneeling down to Payman, and this guy has the exact same haircut that his friend does here. I did talk about this in our last breakdown, but I felt I needed to bring this back up before we get into Bridget. Now after Peter gives a dumb answer in class, she ends up turning around in her seat and staring directly at him, which is a bit out of place. Like, no girls ever stared at me like that before, you know what I mean? You can relate, you're a loser as well. Either way though, she plays a key role in the film, and she's the person who takes Peter away at the party when he's supposed to be looking after Charlie. This allows her to eat the cake, which then leads into her beheading as Peter drives away and tries to get back home. Now we do see her Facebook profile later on, and if we look at the wall of photos, we can see one in the top right that has a lot of significance. In it we see her with a raised arm and a hand bent forward, which is something that also denotes payment. This is what we see the statue in the treehouse doing, and it also happens to Peter in the classroom when the possession takes hold. If you look at the name on the tab along the top, we can also see that his surname is Mulpay. Huge shoutouts to the Many-Faced Girl on Reddit for noticing this, and it has its own meaning that ties in with the film. This isn't exactly a common name, like I don't know anyone Mulpay, and I know at least 10 people, and if we look at the word's origins, it actually means siren. In case you don't know, a siren was a creature that was thought to lure sailors to their deaths, and Bridget could be seen as a figure that draws Peter in. Anyway, that's in the theory time. Was it right? Was it wrong? I'll leave it up to you. Just comment, please. Drop a fucking comment, please. I'm begging. Now, after Annie discovers a triangle in her mother's room, Steve learns that Ellen's body has been stolen from the cemetery. He keeps this quiet from his wife to not cause any more grief, and she lies herself and says that she's going to see a movie. Instead, she's attending a grief counselling session, and in hindsight, if we pay attention to Joan on the right here, we can see she's completely fixated on her.
Now we've set aside some time for any newcomers that might like to speak. So
And when the counsellor asks if anyone would like to speak, she immediately looks over to her, almost willing her to talk, and she stays staring at her until she decides to speak. She brings up how her mother had DID, aka dissociative identity disorder. This involves someone having multiple distinct personalities who could even come from her trying to offer herself up to payment. Later on, Joan introduces herself to Annie, and she talks about how she lost her son and also her grandson. It was only through doing this watch through that I thought it might be connected to payment, and potentially she could have tried to force them to become vessels as well. Now later on, Joan performs a seance with Annie, and she does this through what she says is her grandson's favourite chalkboard. However, we know that was a fucking lie, as when Annie bumps into her in the car park, we can see what she's been buying. As the characters walk past her car, if you pause it on the open trunk, you can see that she's bought a chalkboard set, including the one she later uses. The cult are clearly trying to plant the idea into Annie's head that she needs to carry out a seance, and this is also indicated when we see letters piling through the letterbox. A separate flyer advertising a seance is posted through over the top of these so that Annie will see this first before anything else. She doesn't end up attending though, and thus Joan steps in and makes things up with the chalkboard. Ari Aster said that he used this to show the cult were constantly planning different ways to get the family, and had Charlie's head not gone out the window with the deer, then something else would have been used. Now, I also think this grief scene has a lot going on beneath the surface, and hearing Annie recount stories of her family's mental illness could play into the title itself. The name Hereditary has a lot going on with it, and it can mean things passed on genetically through her family. Annie has almost set up her own family in a similar structure to what she had as a child, with her being a father, mother, son, and a daughter. On her first watch before the reveal of the supernatural elements, I was sure this film would be about mental illness and how traits are passed on down the line. This is what it seemed like when she was rattling off the issues about her family, and it's possible that this is actually the case. The Now Playing podcast went into when payment really came to the forefront of myths and legends, and this happened during the 15th century. They dug up a Dutch figurehead who had pushed him forth, who also had his own roots in the study of mental health. He was the person who put forth the idea that women accused of being witches could actually be dealing with mental health issues, and Ari Aster actually brought in elements of this into the movie. It was only on this viewing that I even considered the entire plot of the film may just be the imaginings of someone having a psychotic breakdown, and the family history is definitely there to support that. Now, one thing that you only learn in the supplemental material is that Steve's a therapist and that Annie was his patient. Her brother too went through his episode at the same age that Steve is now, and upon doing my research I uncovered something else to support that it's all mental. When looking up symptoms of schizophrenia, it's said that people who suffer from it often see lights and people that aren't actually there. This could potentially be the lights in the cult, and though I do take things literally in the movie, I love that there's another way that you can look at all of the elements. Either way, the title Hereditary is echoed in the credits, in which we see one letter from each name dropping down into the next one. This signifies the passing down of genetics, much like how the possession of payment is passed down the family too. Anyway, back in Peter's room we see him blowing smoke out the window, and if you pay close attention to the left side of the screen you can catch someone watching him due to the breath coming out their mouth. In Charlie's room we see payment's light, and this is used throughout the film to highlight certain things. This is a higher power stepping through to influence events, and it leads Charlie outside, which is where she witnesses a ritual. Peter spots it in the classroom, and it also appears to Annie while she's working on a miniature. The light appears at the blinds, and then Annie seemingly knocks over a paint pot, which then draws attention to Joan's number. Let's watch that again in slow-mo though, and pay close attention to that blue bottle. If you zoom in and look closely, you'll see that Annie never actually touched the paint pot, and that this fell over of its own accord. It was purposely pushed to show Joan's number, and the light tends to guide people, but in the case of Peter, it does have a hold over him. You might notice that a beam of light shines down from the rafters directly onto Peter, and then he starts to suffocate like his sister's nut allergy. The classroom scene is the classroom scene, and he ends up smashing his head like it's the like button on this video. Anyway, at the party, we watch as Bridget takes Peter upstairs and catch people watching a video on a laptop. If you look closely, this is actually showing a guillotine, tying back to one of the key motifs in the film. It's not long until Peter heads off, and Charlie heads off too, and all the theories I had about her being one of the big characters, they go out the window.
Ha ha!
Now this is when the film took a massive left turn for me, and I remember in the cinema that so many people had a different reaction to it. There were some people that laughed, others that gasped, and yeah, I just remember this moment hitting harder than Charlie hit that post. Now Peter returns home in shock, and Annie discovers her daughter's body in the morning, which sends her into agonizing grief. One thing that you wouldn't know unless you read the script is that her kneeling on the ground like this is supposed to foreshadow the end of the movie and how the cult all bow before payment. Charlie is buried, and we see her father going through her notepad, which is when he comes across a sketch of a bird. This has been beheaded, and it wears a crown and also has a beak that looks like scissors tying back to her cutting it off. And he spends the night in the treehouse with the heaters on to keep her warm, and she truly feels lost without her daughter. She was far closer to her than she was to her son, and as soon as he shows up at the house, she ends up driving out. After being invited out by Joan, we see the first clue that she was Ellen's friend, and this comes from the welcome mat outside her house.
Welcome mat.
Oh, it's kind of cute, huh?
Yeah, my mother used to embroider ones just like that.
Annie talks about the time she almost set herself on fire, and later she carries this out. It was a psychotic break, and again it ties into this idea of mental health. Cut back to the house, and we get a better look at the miniature, in which there's a house built on top of a house. To me, this is Hereditary in itself, and it shows how the past is built upon the past. It goes beyond taking blood and genetics from people, it's things about them like their mannerisms that also get carried across, and the idea of what a family should be, which is what this represents. We get tension at the dinner table, and the family drama ramps up as the cults start to close in. Now interestingly, Annie at this point says to Peter something about how he always has that stupid face on his face.
And all I get back is that fucking face on your face!
We don't really know what this means because Peter always seems pretty low-key and normal. However, if we look at some of the other scenes in the film, there is some that could hint at what this means. In one of the classroom scenes, Peter sees an evil reflection of himself, and we can catch this smiling back at him. It's possible that this face is what Annie saw too, and this is why she thinks he's walking around with that stupid face on his face. Now Annie is coerced into doing a seance, and that night she sees ants crawling on her pillow and then around the room. Ants of course all follow a queen, and with them gravitating towards her, it could show that she's now been selected as the person to give up their son. She follows these ants through to Peter's room, and they crawl over his head, just like how they crawled over Charlie's. At this point she envisions setting herself and Peter on fire, which is when she's awakened and realizes it's a dream. When discussing this, Ari Aster said that Annie saying she wasn't trying to kill him, she was trying to save him, has its own meaning to it. Annie actually had it within her subconscious that she had to save Peter from his fate, but it's such a horrible thing to carry out that she's in denial she has to do it. This is why she acts it out in dreams, but upon waking up she buries it because she can't face up to it. She carries out a seance that seems to bring Charlie into her, and this explains how she becomes possessed later on. At this point, there's no going back, and the seance being carried out is the beginning of the end for the family. Cut to the night, and Peter awakens to see what looks like Charlie standing over him in the corner of the room. Someone tries to pull his head off, and though we never get confirmed who this is, I think it's clearly Annie. She made the miniature before showing Peter with a missing head, and this could be a case of her sleepwalking again. Now this could also explain what happens with the book in the next scene too. Annie goes to burn it, and this sets her on fire. However, if we look at this from a different angle, it could actually be her burning herself, which we know is something she's done before. Now we cut to Jones, and inside her house see a table mapped out with various items on it. There's a triangle with Peter's face in the middle, and this looks similar to the triangle on the floor that was discovered in Ellen's room. There's also lots of Charlie's dolls and some dead animal heads. Now this foreshadows the ending, and the 3 dolls we see kneeling down represent the figures we see kneeling to payment. The 3 animal heads show the 3 beheadings, and they originally would have been on the 3 dolls we see kneeling. They're all looking to the payment doll, which has a bird's head and crown, and this is of course similar to Charlie's drawing. Realizing the truth, Annie runs down the hall, and we get a lingering shot on her neighbour's door showing the number 202. Now, I sold my soul to payment. Not me, on the guy on Reddit. They had a great theory on what this could be, and depending on whether Jones' home is 201 or 200, it may be tied in with Payman's legend. Payman was said to be one of Lucifer's most loyal servants, and in hell he ruled over 200 angels. And that could be the case if the apartment's 200, and if it's 201, this might tie in with the fact that Payman's followers on Earth were called the 201st Legion. Might be a bloody reach, you know, but we do hang on the 202 for a couple of seconds, so just reading into it. Anyway, after Joan shouts get out to Peter from across the street, Annie discovers the Matson photo of Joan along with her mother going years back. Peter sees a light in the hallway, and as Steve writes an email about his concerns surrounding Annie, he gets an email showing what happened to Ellen's grave. Her corpse is discovered in the attic, and though we probably can't show the missing head, you can see Payman's symbol stitched into her dress. Steve ends up picking Peter up from school, and he's following a similar sort of story to what Annie's own father did. The possession and mental stuff is clearly passed on down through the mother's side, and much like her dad, he finds himself in this unwinnable situation. Weirdly, Peter and Steve, the pair have played father and son before, and they did joke about how they should do this every 10 years. Guys don't look anything alike though, so f*** knows why they keep getting cast like that. But moving on. Now as he burns, Annie stands there gasping, and you can see a light wash over her, which is Payman taking control. Now from here we get an outside shot of the house, and watch as we go from day to night. This happens relatively quickly, and it doesn't seem like anything is wrong. However, if we pause the frame on the nighttime shot, you can actually see people standing out in the forest. It goes by so fast that you might miss it, but it's probably my favourite detail in the entire film. Now we see as Steve wakes up and looks about his room, which also has a really creepy detail in it that you might miss. If you boost the brightness, you can actually see Annie standing in the top corner, and when I first noticed this, I might have needed a change of boxers. Yikes. Now she later follows him downstairs and can be seen standing above him as Peter discovers his father. At this point the chase begins with Peter shutting himself in the attic, and Annie manages to make it in even though he locks this. Now the only way this is possible is if the cult members unlock it from the inside, and we know that they are up in the attic. Peter does what we'd all do in this situation, I think, and man just makes a run for it right out the window. Definitely would risk the broken bones over whatever the fuck this is, but in his weakened state it allows Payman to take over. It was said that the body was needed to be weakened, and this happening means that he can finally take control. We see the light touch his body, and finally Payman's able to possess the male that he's been so desperately seeking. Now in our original breakdown we said the shadow you see floating out the garden is Peter's soul. However, this is wrong, and this is actually Annie's corpse which has just been beheaded. You hear the thud of her body dropping down after the chicken wire makes its way through, and from this point she then flies into the treehouse. As Payman walks along, we also see the body of their dog, showing that the cult killed it so it couldn't alert the family. Up in the treehouse we hear what's almost triumphant music and get the sounds of bells and trumpets. In the legends it's said that Payman's arrival will be accompanied by these instruments, hence why they're used in the score here. Charlie's head is used on the statue, and we can also see Payman's symbol right on the chest. There's a bird cage beside it too, calling back to the ones that have appeared throughout the film, and Joni calls Payman Charlie as she explains exactly what's happening. Ari Aster said that his intention with this line was to show there was never really a Charlie, and that in her body was the demon all along. This is what the click means, and we close out with a wide shot of the attic, filmed once more like miniatures. It appears like a stage, and this continues the thematic idea it's all part of some Greek tragedy that none of the characters could escape from. This has its ties back to classic films as well, and Ari Aster said it's meant to mirror the shot in the movie The Night of the Hunter. Placing them side by side, you can see how much it lines up, and in the end, that closes out the movie. Really hope you enjoyed watching us go back through it, and hopefully I pointed out some stuff that you've missed in the film. We'll be back with another classic movie breakdown really soon, so if you enjoyed this one, then make sure you subscribe. If you want to get access to these videos early, then also consider joining our membership program where we post videos out like this as soon as they're made. If you want something else to watch, then The Power of Christ compels you to check out our breakdown of The Exorcist, which will be linked on screen right now. Love revisiting that film, and I hope you do too. Out of the way, I've been Paul, I'll see you next time. You take care of yourself and enjoy the rest of the week. Peace.